Thank you, Ralph, for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor and a privilege. I do want to correct one thing in my bio. I am not the immediate past president of the Center for Progressive Reform. Rena Steinzor is. I was the president before her. And we did, together with Sid Shapiro at Wake Forest University, put together this organization, which I'm very proud of right now. So I want to talk about market fundamentalism. You've seen some definitions of it. My definition would include kind of 5 basic tenets of market fundamentalism. Ensuring economic liberty, that's this dualistic idea that the only alternative to economic freedom is a government that's controlling us all. Distrust of government, of course, follows as a corollary. Protecting private property is a very strong tenet. Enforcing private contracts, whatever they say, however unequal the bargaining power. And privatizing public goods, which we talked a little bit about, but it needs more discussion. Now, in the context of government regulation, like Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I'm going to talk mostly about health and safety regulation. We've had a lot of talk already about financial regulation. In the context of that sort of regulation, the market fundamentalism really comes down to a presumption against regulation. Jim Buchanan's of the world, public choice folks, have a hard presumption against regulation. The Chicago School, I think as was mentioned earlier on, have a less hard, one can't say a soft presumption, but let's just say a slightly less hard presumption against regulation. But that's really the heart of it all. And interestingly, historically, probably the most influential advocate of this presumption against regulation was Steve Breyer, when he wrote a report for the American Bar Association way back in the late 1970s. The fundamental problem with this presumption against regulation is that that's not what the statutes say. They say pretty much the opposite. If there's a presumption at all in the statutes, these were enacted in response to crises, in response to people demanding action because economic freedom was causing so much harm. So we have the statutes of the 1960s that Ralph played a great role in getting enacted. Those didn't start with the proposition that, oh, we have a market failure here and we need to just fix this market failure. It was that corporations are ruining lives of people. They're killing people, particularly in the workplace and through environmental degradation, and we need to fix that, right? So the presumption really was more of a precautionary presumption in favor of regulation. That's what's in our statutes. And because that's the fact, we've had, in the interim period of time, 5 assaults on these regulatory protections. The first assault came with the election, well, slightly before, about 1978, as the Carter administration was struggling with stagflation. We had the first assault that went through the first 3 years or so of the Reagan administration, where we cut back on regulation, put into effect executive orders that were quite constraining on the regulatory agencies, some of which had just gotten started, really. The second assault came during the Gingrich Congress, the 104th Congress of 1996 and 1997. There, we came within 1 vote in the Senate of enacting a massive omnibus reform that would have put all agencies under the thumb, really, of the regulatees. But that didn't happen. So in a real sense, that assault failed. The third assault came during the first 6 years of the Bush administration. That one was a good deal more, had a great deal more success, but stumbled in the courts. as we had courts that were willing to look at the laws and interpret them to say what they clearly were meant to say. Then came the financial meltdown. That wasn't the only crisis. There was a confluence of crises in 2008, 2009, while we were going through the 2008 elections. We had a food safety crisis. We had miners, if you recall, several horrible mining accidents. There were a number of crises there, and we had this incredible opportunity. This was the opportunity to do the New Deal over again, like we did after the Great Depression. And really sadly, we blew it. It didn't happen. We decided to bail out the banks, first of all, and we've had plenty on that, so I don't need to elaborate on that. But we pulled back on the agencies. We put a fellow in charge of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs who really was trying to constrain these agencies when we had good people at the tops of these agencies wanting to do things, but had them pulled back to the point at which at one point in the White House, President Obama told EPA Administrator Jackson, look, don't amend the ambient air quality standard for ozone like we said we were going to do. We got an election coming up, and what had happened in the interim, of course, was the 2010 election. And what happened during that 2010 election was that because we had done nothing really visibly at that point about Wall Street, and didn't just focus in like a laser on Wall Street, we decided we're going to, our first thing's going to be not even global warming. We put that aside. We're going to do health care, and we're going to do Obamacare, which needed doing, but query whether the first thing to have done, we should have done, was focus like a laser on Wall Street and show how regulation, or the lack of regulation, how amending the regulations during the Clinton administration to let the banks free had caused this problem, and why we needed to get back in the business of constraining the banks. There was a golden opportunity there, and instead we just bailed them out and went on to the next thing. So corporate America, and particularly the think tanks, were able to refocus the national attention, and the problem suddenly wasn't Wall Street anymore, it was government again. And we had the Tea Party came in, and Rena's going to talk more about the Tea Party and that whole movement. And finally, we now have the fifth assault during the Trump administration. Well, I forgot the fourth assault. The fourth assault was that Tea Party, the 2010, but it was very disorganized, and it didn't really accomplish much in the way of deregulation. And in fact, that's when the Obama administration finally kicked in and started doing some things, all of which now are the targets of the fifth assault during the Trump administration. Their very first order of business, and all these agencies, the people that President Obama put in charge, was the first thing you do, whatever it was. Don't care what the benefits, don't care what the costs, get rid of whatever Obama did. That is in all of the agencies. That's got to be your first order of business. After that, now we're ordering the agencies to go look back and see all the past regulations, see how many of those now, going all the way back to Ralph Nader and then in the late 1960s, we can repeal, revise, revoke. In the meantime, of course, the agencies aren't promulgating any new regulations, any new protections, even though we certainly have seen the need for some additional protections. We have an executive order that says for every one regulation you put out, you've got to repeal 2 of them. I don't know how that works. It's a strange thing, but it really hasn't proved much of a limitation on the major agencies out there that are at least protecting health, safety, and the environment, because they weren't promulgating regulations anyway. So it didn't really, the repealing 2 for 1 didn't really matter. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the fallacies of market fundamentalism, some of which are quite familiar, so I won't spend much time on, but a couple I want to talk about. The first is that markets, of course, fail. We've had an ample demonstration of that all morning and in the afternoon. Privatization also fails. Okay, that doesn't work so well either. And I love what Bob Kuttner said about we need to pull back some of that we've privatized. We need to analyze that and limit the scope of markets. A point I want to make that hasn't been made is that markets are embedded in the legal system and in society. They're not apart from, they're not separate from, as Hayek would say. No, they're very much a part of our society. Individual preferences expressed in the marketplace are not exogenous to the social and political context. Other institutions play a large role in shaping those preferences, including families, schools, churches, the entertainment industry, mass media, advertising in a very big way, and the marketplace itself shapes preferences. The public sector shapes preferences, and those are reflected in the marketplace. And the private sector, through lobbyists, legal maneuvering, shapes the legislation and discretionary exercises of public power. Powerful economic actors in the marketplace can limit human freedom, individual rights, just as effectively as government can, if not more so. And that's something I think people understand deep down inside, but every time they hear from Fox News or the Heritage Foundation that it's government, they forget that, or they don't, or it somehow gets lost. The legal system can protect individual rights and preserve freedom from arbitrary exercises of governmental power, while at the same time regulating the marketplace to protect consumers from swindlers, workers from irresponsible employers, minorities from bigots, the environment from polluters, vulnerable people from the consequences of unfettered marketplace power. Political action that changes the rules has a role to play in bringing about a just society because political action shaped the rules that brought about the injustices. A couple of other points I would make about the fallacies. One is that freedom and efficiency are not meta values. They don't trump other values. They are values, they're important, but there are other values like altruism, fairness, decency, mutuality, loyalty, tolerance, equality of opportunity, empathy, concern for vulnerable populations and species, and respect for future generations. These are all values. They're not subordinated to economic freedom or efficiency. Market fundamentalism is morally obtuse, I think. Its fundamental defining virtue is avarice. Okay, and you go look at, well, what, you hear the 7 virtues, so I Googled that. The 7, they're in the, of Christianity and the Catholic Church and various other places. The origin that I found after looking in various places is Prudentius in the 400s AD. But here are the 7 cardinal virtues: chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. Avarice, it turns out, is one of the 7 deadly vices. Okay, but that is the defining virtue of market fundamentalism. As I mentioned, market fundamentalism is as the statutes are written today, and that's the one thing they haven't been able to do, is undo these statutes or change these fundamental protective statutes. And market fundamentalism remains inconsistent with those statutes. And finally, it's profoundly undemocratic. And we've talked about that a bit, but limited government, by definition, means that elected legislatures can't expand government to address social problems. by promising to reduce the role of politics in public life and expand the role of self-regulating, supposedly, rational markets, market fundamentalists offer a seductive path that leads from democracy to oligarchy or even authoritarianism. Carl Polanyi pointed that out years ago. Nancy McLean in Democracy and Change has pointed it out more recently. So what we need to do is uproot this market fundamentalism, do what we can to do that. We need to disembed it and that's going to take an idea infrastructure. That's one of the reasons that Rena and Sid and I put together the Center for Progressive Reform. There are good ideas out there. There's good scholarship out there, but we need to get it off the shelves and into the public and into the people who may in power. We need compelling narratives. I think we need to shift the market fundamentalist focus on individual responsibility to a focus on corporate accountability. That's one way to do it. At a broader level, I think we need to weave a narrative around shared values of economic and physical security for all Americans that is easily as compelling, I think, as the market fundamentalist narrative of that economic freedom is the essence of maintaining individual freedom. Finally, I want to end on a depressing note, and that is James Buchanan's dream was to write a constitution that limited the power of the majority to regulate the minority, the people in economic power. He accomplished that in helping write the Constitution for Chile during the Pinochet regime. It, of course, didn't happen in the United States, but it may not need to. As the Republican Party well knows, what's important, such an important thing, is who controls the courts. And as President Trump fills the courts with activist market fundamentalists like Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, lawyers for regulated companies may find it easier to persuade reviewing courts that agency actions, protective agency actions in some future administration, because they're not going to happen in this one, but protective actions are inconsistent with the authorizing statutes, or that they're arbitrary and capricious, which the courts are empowered to do. At the same time, lawyers for public interest groups will find it more difficult to persuade courts to force agencies to fulfill their statutory responsibilities. Worse, the federal courts are likely to employ expansive definitions of property rights and, as we heard a moment ago, corporate free speech rights that market fundamentalists have been advocating for a long time, these expansive notions. Courts dominated by market fundamentalists, in their hands, the Constitution may be the ultimate trump card over democratic exercises of legislative power. One line of attack that we might use is simply to challenge the legitimacy of decisions in the Supreme Court supported by 5 justices, 4 of whom, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, were confirmed by senators who represent a minority of the popular vote, and actually were opposed by senators who represented a majority of the popular vote. The political situation, and this is in conclusion, the political situation for progressives today is far worse than it was in 1996, when I suggested in an article in the Chicago Law Review that it would take one or more crises brought on by economic or physical disasters to inspire voters to elect a sufficient number of progressive candidates to rebuild debilitated governmental institutions. That was 1996. We had that, and it didn't happen. The Tea Party has taken over the Republican Party. Market fundamentalism has put us on the road to oligarchy or autocracy. There are ways to get off this road, but none of them seem plausible in the current political environment where Too many voters are swayed by Trumpian appeals to fear and bigotry. It will probably take another confluence of crises to demonstrate once again that market fundamentalism is a deeply flawed ideology that causes far more harm than the modest benefits that it provides to society. As the Trump administration's demolition crew succeeds in its efforts to deconstruct the administrative state, those are Steve Bannon's words, we should be preparing to use those crises that are inevitable, they're going to follow, as teaching moments to persuade the American public that excessive economic freedom is freedom to harm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Excuse me. Thank you very much. I want to point out that the second assault on regulation, which was the so-called regulatory reform drive, the leader against that, who won the battle, is Joan Claybrook. Where's Joan? She led the fight in the Congress, representing citizen groups, public citizen, got the labor unions more aggressive against it, and it was defeated. That would have been a real disaster. A very clever procedural obstruction, so-called reform, in addition to its substantive diminishment of consumer health and safety rights. Tom, you might be interested, if you don't know already, in the work of Edgar Kahn, who's, as you know, professor at UDC Law School, but he was the dean of Antioch Law School years ago. He developed this three economies: the market economy, the public goods economy, and then the core household economy, the trillions of dollars that people in households, raising children, et cetera, taking care of people, in terms of the values that you listed and have been subordinated by the value of avarice or greed. Our next speaker, again on the same subject, the assault on regulation, is Rena Steinzor. She's a professor at the University of Maryland School of Law and has taught administrative law, food safety law, and advanced courses on the regulatory system, as well as legal analysis and writing contracts. She's the author of Why Not Jail for Corporate Crooks? Why Not Jail? She also wrote Industrial Disasters, Corporate Malfeasance, and Government Inaction. Professor Steinzor is a founder and former president and member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform, in which Professor McGarity played a prominent role as well. From 1987 to 1993, she practiced law at Spiegel and McDermott, a Washington, D.C. law firm representing cities, counties, states, and public agencies in the environment and energy, communication, transportation fields. So she didn't work at a corporate law firm. Professor Steinzor.
I also appreciate being invited. I have to tell you that 9 times out of 10, I find myself at some conservative meeting where there are 1 or 2 people who are representing the wackos, as President Trump would say. And I always introduce myself by saying that I'm going to be the skunk at the picnic, and they better duck before I spray them. But today, I'm going to actually try and be upbeat and peppy, at least in the beginning. Half a century ago, as Tom was discussing, Congress passed a torrent of legislation to protect public health, worker and consumer safety, and the environment. Of course, Ralph was there, as were the disaffected young people in the wake of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and Watergate. And all those laws, which were in their own way notable in some ways as the Great Society and the New Deal, they never had a name. The period never had a name. Why? Because there wasn't a single president who announced them as an agenda. Instead, they were passed by Congress and then handed off to the executive branch, and there were so many parents and foster parents and step-parents in the room that they never had a name, and I'm going to call them the Precautionary Era. In my mind, we don't spend enough time conceiving for people that that happened, and that for the most part, these laws are still on the books, the infrastructure's there. They haven't been gutted in any significant respect, and they've gone perhaps dormant now because we're not updating them, we're not writing regulations, and we're, most important of all, not enforcing them. But there they stay, and they're something to be proud of. They're there for a president to use when more progressive forces take back the White House. It's true that corporations have fought these laws tooth and nail. In the beginning, I don't think they ran to Congress and spoke out against them. They were instead playing an inside game, and they started very early to go to the White House. There were various councils established of businessmen to make sure that the agency leadership didn't get out of control. That was later institutionalized in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which ironically now plays a pretty small role from what I can tell, because the agency heads themselves, and this is really one of the first times we've seen this so across the board, the agencies, the heads themselves don't believe in the missions of the agencies. But industry sort of tried to do subverted sabotage, and I'll talk about those tactics in a minute. But it's worth saying that things are much better than they have been. We have much cleaner air and water. We have, for the most part, they may be overpriced, but prescription drug system that works largely, even though it depends on foreign imports, which come from unregulated countries. We have a start on making lending fair through the CFPB, even though it is now dormant. So things are better than they were before all these things passed. And that's the end of my peppy talk, so I'll sit down. No. But as Rob said, as other people discussed, today American corporations spend $2.6 billion a year on lobbying expenditures. That's about $4.6 million for every member of Congress. With that amount of money, you could send a phalanx of good-looking young lobbyists of either sex to sit in the lobby of an office of a member of Congress and literally follow the person around every time he or she is in Washington, which is less and less often these days. There are 10-to-1 spending on climate change legislation, which because no one has said it yet, I will say it now, is by far the most urgent problem that we face. It's for all the human pain and suffering that I acknowledge that comes from financial problems, climate change is going to do us in at the rate we're going. And I spent a lot of time apologizing to my children who are now in their 20s because they are going to reap the whirlwind of this. And if that wasn't clear before, it should be clear after this most recent report from the IPCC. So 10-to-1 spending on that. What are the tactics that are used? Because after my peppy talk and now my depressing talk, I am going to be controversial, so I want to rush through the depressing part since we've had so much of that today. The subtle underground sabotage of these agencies, which has persisted for the last 20 years, and it disappoints me to say, because he probably was the best president in my lifetime. I wasn't alive for Franklin Roosevelt, and I can't forgive Lyndon Johnson for Vietnam. I just can't bring myself to do it. I try. We had Barack Obama, who ignored government. He did not defend his government. He did not articulate to people why the government was playing a very important role in their lives. And this was, in retrospect, as we take an objective look at his legacy, really was the most disappointing, in some ways, things he did. He did not educate people about why they needed protection and why all these laws were so important. And what ended up happening was the first tactic was very successful. That's the let's get the government down to the size where I can drag them in the bathroom, drag it in the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. The agencies, most of them, are operating at the same level as funding as they had in the mid-1980s before so many laws were passed and the population was several tens of millions smaller than it is today. Starve them. Second, bash bureaucrats. I spend a lot of time, of course, as Tom does too, around young people. Every year I teach administrative law, and I ask my class, how many of you would like to work for the government? And then I have to really lean over and peer to see the 2 or 3 hands that go up. This is a terrible problem. And why is that? Because they watch bureaucrats being denigrated, attacked, demeaned, having their pay cuts cut, all designed to make government seem as if it is the enemy, not the protection for the American people. And we've gotten to the point now where congressmen literally sit, and if you haven't seen this, I refer you to Chaffetz, if that's how you pronounce his name. I can think of other names, but I won't get into them because we're being filmed. Yelling at Gina McCarthy, the administrator of EPA, literally shouting at the top of his lungs at her, not letting her finish a sentence. The topic, ironically, was the water supply in Flint, which is a terrible tragedy, but if I remember correctly, it was a Republican governor who was in charge of the state at that point, and municipal officials who were ultimately prosecuted criminally for poisoning those children, which did happen. But Gina McCarthy could have done more, to be sure, but does not deserve to be screamed at as if, well, I'm move on. The third tactic is cross-cutting statutes that engender paralysis by analysis. And we've seen this across the board. My friends in the financial sector have been running around waving their arms about the court decision that requires financial agencies under Dodd-Frank to do cost-benefit analysis of regulations. And we sort of smirk to ourselves a little bit because we've been living in that world for 20 or 30 years, and all the stuff that goes on with cost-benefit analysis, at its best, it is churning out hundreds of thousands of pages of paper per rule that don't make much sense and don't make much difference because the rules are killed for political reason. And at its worst, it is impressing in the whole idea structure that you have to monetize life. The going rate now is about $10 million, but it's discounted. So if you get exposed to a chemical today, you don't get cancer for 20 years. Our question is how much you have to invest today to end up with the $10 million in 20 years. Think to yourself what's going to happen with climate change. The need to protect future generations is going to be discounted to zero before you've even taken out your Texas Instruments calculator that, if you had a gun to my head, I couldn't use. So that's where we are. And of course, the election of Donald Trump. Tom covered that, so I'm not going to backtrack other than to say that when Trump was first elected, he mounted a blitzkrieg. I actually think, I try to imagine, put myself in the place of all the lobbyists on K Street, and I think they were probably sitting in their conference rooms the day after the election pinching themselves. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have an agenda for this whole thing. But they rapidly recovered, jumped to their feet, and started organizing a campaign that 3 months after Congress convened, 3 or 4 months, was certainly by May, 14 rules had been killed with barely a word of debate on the floor under the Congressional Review Act. Now, things have slowed down since then. There have been a lot of sloppy efforts to revoke rules that have failed in the courts because we still do have some good judges. But it's an example of how absolutely determined all these folks were. So now, let me get a little controversial. I think, as I listen to us today, that we're very corporation-focused. And I want to be the first to admit that in close to 45 years in Washington, that's all I've thought about too. Corporations, they suck. Oh, excuse me. They're bad, they're disgusting, and they're the cause of all of our problems. And I understand why we all feel that way, but I don't think it is the solution to figuring out what's going on with the American people today. It's not the only solution. Think about the kinds of things that happen that corporations can't possibly support. They're not in favor of failing to raise the debt ceiling. They're not in favor of shutting down the government. They're probably not even that enthusiastic about sabotaging the Affordable Care Act. Big corporations are not, because without that kind of coverage, they have restless employees, small businesses, undoubtedly in favor of that. Not so clear that big ones are. And attacking the civil service is amusing, perhaps, but when they want to get a permit through or they want to get a license done, they're not in favor of dealing with anyone who can't find another job absolutely at all. They're not in favor of that. They want the government on some level for those things to work. Not saying they're not anti-regulation, just saying that some of the things that are happening that are the most damaging are not what they want. So something else must be going on. And if we take a careful look at this, what we find are that the biggest chunks of voters in the Republican Party today are the Tea Party. That's true, although it's a wing that is amorphous. It's not as well organized as it may think it is. There's certainly the Freedom Caucus in the House. There are races where there are self-identified Tea Party people running, and what they believe is that it really isn't necessary to help vulnerable people. Most Tea Party members are white. Most of them are in their late 50s, early 60s. They're relatively affluent, and they have no sympathy for people of color, immigrants, the disabled, and other vulnerable groups. No sympathy at all, and they say that. I mean, they announce that. They believe that they deserve Medicare, but they don't think that anyone else deserves a hand from the government because they didn't, quote unquote, earn it. And one of the most seditious things is this conveys the children of everyone who is not a child of a Tea Party member to having no equal possibility, because the Tea Party also believes in very small government, including at the local level, so there's no hope of education. There's no hope even of Head Start, something as basic as that. Second major bloc that is part of the Republican Party and is in fact much better organized than the Tea Party, and that is ignored for the most part by all of us, is white evangelicals. They voted 81% for President Trump. They represent 30% of the membership of the Republican Party today. Why do I worry about them? Because they're not just concerned about abortion and cultural issues like that. Their ideas about what should be happening in the country have moved far beyond that, because they have supported and been so enthusiastic about the Republican Party for so long. There's even a group of them who are actually the favorites of Donald Trump. They're called the Prosperity Gospel. And what they say is, if you are a devout Christian and you worship in the way that the evangelical church tells you, you will be rich because God will reward you on this earth. And he has appointed one of these pastors, who is one of the very few women visible in this movement, to be the head of his advisory council. Members of the white evangelical community, and I say that very clearly because I'm not talking about African American or Hispanic evangelicals, who are a very different group. Members of this movement believe in small government. They believe that if people need a hand or need protection, the church will provide it. And most importantly, they believe we don't have to do a single thing about climate change, because they don't believe it's happening. But even if it is, even if they can see that the hurricanes are getting worse, they write that off as a sign that the end of days are imminent. And I'm not being flippant or sarcastic at all. I have spent a lot of time reading about all this, and I can cite chapter and verse if anybody's interested. The final group, which I think is very important for us to pay attention to, is so-called sovereign citizens. This is the group that took over the wildlife refuge and over social media organized hundreds of their followers to bring their guns to this facility and proceeded to occupy it for 41 days. Now, why are they important? First of all, the cops could do nothing because they did not want to repeat Waco. I do want to mention that the people that bombed Oklahoma City, the Murrah building, one of them was a self-identified sovereign citizen. So this level of violence from a relatively small group of people, when the police seem to be so nervous about interfering with them, is a threat in the West, which is red country. But the message that it sends is that if you are an employee of the Department of Interior, who are responsible for 47% of the land in the West, where we have all sorts of things going on, national parks, wildlife refuges, a whole series of things, you cannot be comfortable that you will not find yourself confronting people who believe that you cannot interfere on any basis with their right to be armed and their right to do as they please. Now, all of this is to say that I think we need to broaden our perspective, understand more, in a more sophisticated way, who the bodies are that are voting for far-right candidates, especially because we have this constitutional problem that Tom mentioned. He pointed out, very good point, that most of the people on the Supreme Court were going to, or the conservative wing now, was confirmed by senators who did not represent most of the country, and that is our problem. Dare we open up the Constitution? No. This is why we've had a spate of books talking about whether American democracy can survive. And unless we pull the camera back and look at the ideologies that have come up or been pushed down, because certainly the Koch brothers, among other, the Scaife Foundation, they have all funded these groups in the past. Unless we develop a more sweeping perspective on what our problem is, we won't be equipped to deal with it. So thank you very much.